I work as an emergency room nurse at a large hospital, and I was working the night shift at the time. During my time on that shift, I saw many strange and shocking things. This story, however, is about the scariest thing that I've ever experienced. My shift began at 10 p.m. and went until 6 in the morning. It was a large hospital in the downtown core of the city where I live. There was a whole hospital district in the area. The children's hospital was right next door, and the cancer ward was not far off. It was a warm summer night. The city was dark as I drove my car into the staff parking area. The security guard checked my badge and waved me in. I parked and walked to the entrance, like I had many times before. When I stepped into the building, the somber tranquility of the night was replaced by the fast-paced hustle of a big city emergency room. You wouldn't even know it was nighttime in this place. The bright fluorescent lights shone down on the busy hallway, leading to a feeling that was indistinguishable from daytime. The next several hours were fairly normal by my standards. The job in general is incredibly hectic, and the night was no different. Basically what I'm saying was that it was a typical crazy night. However, things were taken to another level when a new patient entered the emergency room. He burst through the front entrance covered in blood. Holding his abdomen, he trudged into the waiting room with a look of agony on his face. He looked to be about 40 years old, with long hair. He had a short beard and wore blue jeans. One of the other nurses and I approached him and helped him into the operating room. We cut his shirt off in order to find the source of the blood. His flannel shirt was heavy, having been soaked in blood. I think it was supposed to be yellow with a plaid pattern, but it was impossible to tell. All I could see was red. Looking at his bare chest, it was easy to see the wound. It was a clear knife wound on his stomach on the right side of his body. I quickly stopped the bleeding. His condition was stabilized. Believe it or not, this kind of thing was actually quite common. The other nurse and I were well within our ability to handle the situation. What happened next is what really terrified me. I was alone with the man. He was conscious but laying still. The stab wound was the only serious injury, but I couldn't help but notice several other injuries on his body. They were not bad enough to require emergency treatment, but there were noticeable scratch marks on his arms and face. They were deep, long marks in rows of 3 or 4. They had surely come from fingernails. My expertise is healthcare. I'm not a detective. I don't have the skills to analyze the meaning of a certain type of wound, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But these scratches looked defensive. I was almost sure of it. This man had done something to someone. My gaze moved slowly from the man's arms to his face. He turned to look at me at the same time, and we locked eyes. We held eye contact for several seconds. My mind was racing. Does he know that I know? I thought. Just then, he tried to reach out and grab my arm. Luckily, my reflexes were faster than his, and I quickly left the room. Fortunately, the police were already there, as is common when there's a stabbing. I told the officer what I had seen. He assured me that they would look into it. The man was treated for several more hours by my coworker, and eventually, the case was turned over to the police. I never found out exactly what happened between this man and whoever else was involved, but my intuition tells me that he was bad news. All I can do is hope that whoever the other person was, they got away in better shape than he did. I had been working at a local gas station for a few years at the time. It was the job I had throughout high school, and after graduation, I kept it for a year or two while I was figuring some things out. I started doing the night shift when I no longer needed to get up for school. The pay was better, and I also preferred it for some other reasons. The store never got really busy at night. The pumps were automated, and almost everyone paid at the pump instead of coming in, so it was pretty easy. That, and I was a bit of a night owl anyway. Some would say that I was a video game addict, and they would be right. I was pretty much nocturnal anyway, so the choice to do the night shift was pretty easy. The gas station was on the corner of a quieter street. There were 4 pumps out at the front and a pair of dumpsters at the side. I would take the garbage out every morning at the end of my shift, and the garbage truck would come and empty them right after, as I was leaving for the day at 5 a.m. It was close to 4 a.m. and quiet so far. I don't think I saw more than 3 or 4 customers in the 6 hours that I'd been on duty. I stood behind the counter staring at my phone. I used this time to do some reading and browse social media. The empty store was silent apart from a dull hum from the fluorescent lights that hung overhead. I looked up from the screen of my iPhone when a car pulled into the parking lot. It was an older Pontiac with some noticeable dents and a green paint job with several rust spots. One strange thing was that the headlights were out. It was very dark, and driving around without headlights was downright dangerous at this time. It didn't go to one of the pumps, and I couldn't see where it parked. Thinking it was just somebody turning around, I went back to my phone. Not more than a few minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the side of the building where the dumpsters are. It sounded like someone had opened the lid and slammed it against the side of the building. Whoever was in that car must be throwing something out, I thought. People do that from time to time. It's not allowed, so I usually go out there and tell them that they can't use the dumpsters. I walked out from behind the counter and out the front door. As I made my way closer, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. Although I wasn't sure what it was, I decided to proceed with caution. I nervously peeked around the corner and saw the car parked in front of the garbage area. A dark figure stood next to the car, but I couldn't make out anything about him. It was too dark. I stood there for several seconds watching, but I couldn't tell what he was doing, although I know he must have been throwing something away. There was just something about this guy that gave me the creeps. I can't explain exactly what it was about him, but for some reason, I decided not to make myself known. I quietly crept back into the store and went back to my post behind the counter. A feeling of relief struck me when I saw the car drive out past the pumps. There was not another customer for the rest of my shift, which was only about another hour. Like I said, I take the garbage out every morning before I finish, so I gathered the few scraps of trash that were in each of the garbage bins throughout the store and packed them into a single large black garbage bag. I flipped the light switch on the other side of the building where the dumpsters were. While I was walking to the dumpster, I remembered the creepy guy from an hour before. Although it didn't occur to me to check what he had thrown out, I realized that I was about to find out. The bright bulbs shone down on the green bins like spotlights, as if they were an exhibit at some kind of a strange modern art gallery. I had to squint my eyes as I approached. When I reached the closest bin, I swung open the large lid and it crashed on the side of the building, causing that familiar noise. Before throwing the bag in, I leaned over and looked inside. What I saw left me so shocked that I dropped the garbage bag on the ground. There was a pile of black garbage bags, and at least one of them was dripping with a red liquid. I had seen enough. I ran into the store and locked the door, then hid behind the counter. I frantically called 911 and told the operator everything, my hand shaking so much that I could hardly hold the phone. The police arrived quickly after, and sure enough, there was a body in the dumpster. I did my best to give them a description of the guy, but like I said, it was so dark without the lights on that I couldn't really tell what he looked like. I was, however, able to give them a description of the car, and based on that, they were able to track the guy down and arrest him. As of this time, he's awaiting trial for murder, and I'm expecting to testify as a witness. I've seen some strange things while working the night shift, but this is by far the scariest. Although terrifying, I continued to do the night shift for several more months. I've never experienced anything like this since, and I hope I never do again. My father used to work as a corrections officer at the state prison where we lived. Although he used to love the job, he left shortly after this incident. Considering what happened, I don't think anyone will blame him. He was working the night shift at the time. It was a pretty laid-back job for the most part. The inmates were all locked up in their cells during his shift. He used to tell me about some of the crazy things that happened during the day. Fights, riots, and everything you can imagine. The night shift, however, was really quite peaceful and relaxing. He used to say that once he got used to the sleep schedule, it was really the better option. My father would usually patrol the prison a few times per shift. Sometimes he would drive around in one of those guard trucks or keep watch in one of the towers. However, on this night, his boss told him to do a sweep of the prison chapel. There wasn't much to it, he told me. You just had to walk around and make sure that nobody was there who shouldn't be. He walked through the yard to the chapel. The large empty space gave off an eerie vibe. Bright floodlights on the prison wall cast a long shadow of my father's body as he trudged past the empty basketball courts. He came up to the front door of the chapel, and when he did, a wave of nervousness came over him. At the time, he didn't know why, so he pushed the large oak door open and stepped inside. He flicked on the light switch and started checking some of the small rooms at the front of the building. After a few minutes, a man walked out of the office at the back of the chapel. He seemed to be another guard. He was wearing the same uniform as my father. However, my dad didn't know this guy. That wasn't that unusual, since sometimes the guards from the day shift would take a night shift for extra money or to cover for someone. Even still, he was confused because his boss asked him to check the chapel. Why would he do that if someone was already there? My father asked the man, "Are you here to do a sweep of the chapel?" "Yes, I'll take it from here," the man replied. My dad stood there confused for several seconds, then said, "Oh, okay. I'll let the boss know." He left the chapel and walked back to his boss's office in the main building. His boss looked up from his desk and said, "How did you get done so fast? You couldn't have possibly checked the whole place in such a short amount of time." "Another guard was there. He said he'd check it out," my dad replied. "Okay, as long as someone checked it," the boss said. My dad was confused at this point. He figured the other guard must have been sent there by someone. If his boss didn't know, then who was that guy? 3 days later, my father was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case. There were various awards and old photos of other guards from times in the past. As he was browsing through the photos, he saw something that made his heart sink. One of the pictures was a memorial to a guard who had been killed in a riot about 20 years ago. The picture was of the guard that my father saw in the chapel that night. He had never been a believer in the paranormal before, but this experience caused him to change his mind. He didn't bother to tell any of his coworkers out of fear that he'd be ridiculed, and not long after, he left the job and made a career change. Although this was a terrifying incident for him, it is one of his favorite stories to tell. I've heard it more than a few times from him, and although I wasn't sure at first, I actually do believe it too. I'm a 27-year-old male, and I live in the UK with my fiancé. I currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special needs in a school not far from Bradgate Park. I've worked in a number of schools and children's homes now, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old renovated houses or halls. This story happened in 2013, when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults, 18 to 30 years old, who had autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked at was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house, an activity room that led to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks, and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all the residents were settled for the night, and then get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all my jobs done at around 1 a.m., and I'd spend the rest of the night listening to anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course textbooks, or just play some games on my phone once I was finished. The residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not his actual name, was particularly restless. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him. One time, he got into one of his bad moods, and he threw a member of the staff through a patio door because she'd forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences, and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like, "James, make breakfast," when he was ready to make breakfast, or "James, go outside," if he wanted to go out and play. He was generally well behaved, and could be quite funny when he wanted to be, but he was known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and then he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes to make sure that he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James's bedroom was a communal living room with board games, TV, sofa, books, and stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something drop in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went up the stairs and knocked on the door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm, and his eyes must have been half shut, like he'd been asleep. I asked if he was okay. He said yes, and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had knocked something over by accident. An hour passed, and by then, I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another big bang above me, again like something had been dropped. This time I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house had been set up for 5 residents, but there were only 4 at the time, and the room above me was the spare. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to their conditions, each resident had an alarm fitted to their door that was activated at night. That way, if anybody left their room, a small receiver box would sound an alarm. The night staff carried around the box, and it made a little noise to indicate which door had been opened. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew that the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs, covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 members of the staff were with him. After a few minutes, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For the last 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, "Sarah, little girl," when he was asked what was wrong. That was something we'd never experienced from him before, and the general conclusion was that he'd seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head and made him repeat the phrase. Once James had settled in bed, the night staff left and the other members of staff went to the staff bedroom. I got on with my tasks, and as usual, I finished around 1 a.m. Soon after, I went upstairs to do a quick check of the other residents. When I got to the first floor landing, I noticed that the light had been turned off. There were 2 small corridors leading to the bedrooms, on the left and right side of the staircase. James's room was on the left side, and the light switch was just outside his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there in the darkness, in complete silence, was James. He stood in the corner, with his eyes as wide as he could possibly hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3", and I weigh about 220 pounds, but in that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James, and asked him what he was doing. For a while, he said nothing at all. Then, as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up and helped me to calm the situation and get James back into bed before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off. I was relieved that the incident happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told that the situation with James had gotten a lot worse. He would spend hours staring at the window that overlooked the garden, just saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" We still didn't know where he had heard that phrase. That night, at around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that door number 5 had opened. That was the spare room. That instantly seemed a bit weird, because the door to the spare room was always locked. I went up to investigate and found James standing in the room, in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me and just stood there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate. Let's get you back to bed. It's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second, I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed out, "Oh no," and started pummeling the door with both fists. When he did this, the alarm went off to indicate that the front door had been opened. The only people with a key to the front door were myself and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key, and 2 that require an electronic ID card. It was now 3:25 in the morning, and the manager never came in before 8 a.m., so I presumed there must have been some kind of mistake. I stayed with James and continued trying to defuse the situation. He finally calmed down and went back into his room. I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house in case someone had gotten in. I then checked on each of the residents to make sure they were all still in the house. Everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m. when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that somebody was tapping on his window. I thought he must have been dreaming because his room was on the 3rd floor of the house and it was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room to reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut and the security lock was still sealed. As he got back into bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see what it was, but there was no one there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold and asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank into his bed, pulling his duvet up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there, and then left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was the middle of January, and it was around -2 outside, but I felt I had to get out of that place for a while. After around 40 minutes, I went back inside and washed my cup in the sink. I dried it and then put it back in the cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked drawer, which is where we kept all the sharp knives. The drawer was slightly open. This was obviously a major issue, because none of the residents were allowed to access the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized that there was one missing, so I woke up the sleep-in staff and told her the situation, then we began to search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found the missing knife, so we decided to just keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. We went up to check it out and found out that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if it was still locked? I went inside and turned the lights on. To this day, I have no explanation for what I found. The bed had been pushed from its usual place. It was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing was broken. The most disturbing part, though, was that in the middle of the room, there was a children's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess is that it was made in the 50s, from the style of the clothes and the overall look. The bracelet was simple, but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed that the bracelet belonged to them, and it was soon taken to a charity shop along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned the little girl or stood in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened. Sometimes I think it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that the house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of the stuff that happened can't be explained logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal, who knows. But now I work day shifts, and I don't plan on working the night shift again anytime soon. The night shift at the gas station was always quiet and uneventful, but that's what I liked about it. I was the only one working, and I had the place to myself. I would stock the shelves, clean the floors, and wait for the occasional customer to come in. It was the perfect job for someone like me who enjoyed the solitude of the night. But tonight was different. The weather was terrible. A raging storm was sweeping through the area, and the power had gone out. I was stuck in the gas station alone after dark. I tried to keep busy, but the silence was deafening. All I could hear was the muffled noise from the heavy rain. As the storm raged on, I started to hear strange noises coming from outside. I tried to ignore them, but they were getting louder and closer. I could hear something scratching at the door, and I knew I had to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way to the door. When I opened it, a gust of wind blew in, drenching me in rain. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear something breathing heavily. I froze, not sure what to do. And then out of nowhere, a figure burst into the store. I stumbled back and fell to the ground. I was sure I was going to die. But as the figure got closer, I managed to get a look at him. All I could see was a dark outline, but it was a man. A giant of a man. He was at least 6'5" with wild hair and a bushy beard. He wore a large coat, but even without it, I'm sure he would have been huge. I scurried behind the counter and sounded the alarm, but I knew help was minutes away, and I didn't have minutes. I scanned the place for the guy, but I lost him. I could hear him though, and his movements sounded close. I knew that I had to find a weapon, something to defend myself. I found a baseball bat and brandished it in front of me. The man let out an amused laugh and lunged at me again. I swung the bat with all my might, and it connected with him and made a sickening thud. He let out a final cry and fell to the ground motionless. I couldn't tell where I got him, but I didn't want to stay and find out. I ran out of that place and down the street. I was drenched in rain in less than a minute. Suddenly, I noticed the flashing red and blue lights that I'd been waiting for. It felt like an eternity since I'd called, but looking back, I know it was probably less than 5 minutes. I walked back to the store to meet the police. When I got there, my attacker was gone. I turned over the surveillance footage to the police, but since the power was still out, we couldn't watch it on the spot. However, the police were never able to find the guy. I was lucky to have escaped with my life, but I know that I'll never be the same again. The memory of that night will haunt me forever, and I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering when the man will return. I quit my job at the gas station and never went back. I've been a security guard for over a decade now, and in that time, I've seen some strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for the night when this story took place. It was 2018, and I was working the night shift at a hotel downtown. The job was really easy. I was really into sci-fi books at the time, and I had a lot of time to read. There was a security office at the back of the building, which is where I spent most of my time. Other than that, I would do a few patrols of the building and the parking lots every few hours throughout the evening. It was a typical quiet night at the hotel. I was making my rounds, checking doors and windows, when I heard a loud noise coming from the parking lot. At first, I thought it might be a car backfiring, but as the noise continued, I knew something was wrong. It was 2:30 in the morning, and the place was an absolute ghost town. Any noise at all stood out like a sore thumb, so those loud thuds I was hearing in the parking lot were very concerning. I immediately called the police, and then headed towards the source of the noise. As I approached the parking lot, I saw a figure in a hoodie trying to break into a car. My heart was pounding in my chest as I shone my flashlight at him, and I ordered him to stop. As soon as I got those words out, he took off running. I chased after him, my breaths coming in gasps as I tried to keep up. I just needed to stay with him long enough for the police to show up. He was fast, and I was starting to lose ground when he suddenly disappeared. I stopped and shone my flashlight in every direction, but I saw no sign of him. Just when I thought I lost him, I heard a faint noise coming from a nearby alley. My hand went to my weapon, which was a can of pepper spray, as I cautiously approached. That's when I saw him. The man was hiding behind a dumpster, trying to catch his breath. I ordered him to surrender, but he refused. He came at me with a wild look in his eyes, and then he jumped on me. Before I knew it, we were rolling around on the ground fighting. I was cursing myself for following this man. I should have waited for the police, I thought. The man was strong, but I was able to overpower him and subdue him until the cops arrived. The man turned out to be a wanted felon with a long history of violence and theft. It's been a few years now, but I still think about that night. The feeling of fear, the adrenaline rush, and the physical struggle with the criminal will always be part of me. I'm grateful for the training I received, and I know it helped me handle the situation as best I could. But I also know that being a security guard is more than just making rounds and checking doors. It's about being prepared for anything, and being able to handle dangerous situations, rare as they may be. When I was 20 years old, I was working at a gas station on the other side of town from where I lived. I had recently finished high school, and I took the night shift as a way to make extra money, since my main job didn't pay very much. The gas station was open all night, but my shift was from 7 p.m. until midnight, which worked out well since my other job ended at 5. It sounds like a rough schedule, and it was, but if I'm being completely honest, the work was really easy. It was made even better by the fact that I really got along with all my coworkers. The actual store never got very busy, since most people would pay at the pump anyway. The night was usually a combination of scrolling through Instagram and cracking jokes with my coworker, occasionally being interrupted by a customer asking where the bathroom is. The late shifts always had 2 workers, not because it was busy, but for safety reasons. It's always best to have another person around to watch your back, and my coworkers and I took this responsibility very seriously. This incident took place on a Thursday night at around 11 p.m. It was me and one other guy, John. He was younger than me, 18 I think, and he was still in high school. He had short red hair and a smooth face. I don't think he even needed to shave yet. I'd been working there longer than him, and we had kind of a big brother, little brother dynamic between us. He would ask me how to do everything, even though I'm pretty sure he was smart enough to figure it out for himself. It was the middle of August, and even though it was late at night, the store was incredibly hot. Because of that, we would often prop open the door to the back alley. That way there would be some nice airflow whenever someone walked in the front door. Always a welcome relief from the summer heat. All that being said, John and I had a great time talking and joking around when the store was empty during the late hours. I was at the front of the store tidying up some of the shelves, and John was in the back organizing the stock room when I noticed 2 cars pull up to the front of the store. One of them was an old sedan with some noticeable rust spots on the body. The other was a white minivan with tinted windows. The minivan went to one of the pumps, and the car was parked in one of the spots at the front. I quickly finished what I was doing and made my way back to the counter in case one of them needed to pay for something. At this point, I was not sure if the 2 were together. I suspected that they probably were, because very few customers come in at this hour, and 2 vehicles coming at the same time was unusual to say the least. I waited for a few minutes, and eventually, a single man walked into the store. He was a short guy, probably 30 years old, and thin as a twig. He was wearing a white tank top and baggy blue jeans that seemed at least a few sizes too big. He looked straight at me with a blank look on his face. The man walked towards me, not breaking eye contact. As he approached the counter, I saw him reach behind his back, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a handgun. The store had a silent alarm that could be activated discreetly. but I was a few steps away from it, and I couldn't risk making a move. John was in the back, and I knew he could hear whatever was going on in the store, so I said loudly, "No problem, sir. Don't shoot. Take whatever you want." That should have been enough for John to call the police. However, when I said that, the man rolled his eyes and smiled. Then he looked over to the side. I turned to look in the same direction, and what I saw was an unconscious John being carried out from the back by a second man. He must have come in through the open back door. That was when they asked for the money. I promptly opened the cash register and emptied it into a bag, then handed it to one of them. Then I filled another bag with all the lottery tickets and handed that to him as well. The man holding John then said to me that if I didn't call the police, they would let him go safely. After that, both men walked out the front door, one of them still carrying John, and both cars took off. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. I hesitated to call the police because of what the man said. However, I soon decided that I needed to call them, so I dialed 911 and reported the incident. The police arrived within minutes and reviewed the security footage. I waited as patiently as I could, considering the circumstances. Not long after, one of the officers told me that they were able to see the license plate from one of the cars. Not the smartest criminals, I guess. Later that night, I learned that both men were caught by the police, and I was brought into the station to identify them. A tremendous sense of relief washed over my entire body when I saw both those guys standing in a lineup. I quickly chose the two men who were not clever enough to cover their faces. After that, I asked one of the officers where John was. He looked at me with a solemn expression and placed his right hand on my shoulder. Then he told me that John had never been found. Search parties worked day and night for the next several days, but they turned up nothing, and eventually they were called off. To this day, no one knows what happened to him because neither of the men ever talked and no evidence was found. It has weighed heavily on my conscience ever since. John and I were meant to watch out for each other, and I can't help but feel that I failed him. I always wonder if things would have turned out differently had I not called the police, as one of the men said. Maybe they would have let him go, maybe not. I think not knowing is the hardest part of all, and I have to deal with that every day. My first job was at the gas station down the street from my high school. I worked Thursday and Friday evenings every week. My shifts were 6 p.m. until midnight. Even though the schedule did interfere with my schoolwork, my parents allowed it because they thought it would be good for me to get some work experience. After my first few weeks on the job, I would be alone for the last 2 hours of my shift. There was another guy who would be there until 10 p.m. That was fine with me because it was usually really dead by that time. I was standing behind the counter, staring at my phone one night at around 11 p.m. Suddenly, the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, probably 6'2", with a long dirty coat and sunglasses. He wore a brimmed hat and also had a long beard, so I couldn't really see much of his face. My first thought was that he was going to rob the place because it looked like he had made some effort to conceal his appearance. The guy slowly walked up and down the aisles, then he stood in the back of the store next to the coffee machine. He just stood there. He didn't buy anything, and he never said a word to me, or so much as looked in my direction. At 5 minutes to close, he simply walked out the front door the way he came. I didn't even have to ask him to leave. I was relieved when he left, but obviously creeped out. Why would anybody just stand in a store for an hour without buying anything? I guess it was not technically against any of our rules, but it was incredibly frightening for me, especially since I was alone. On my next shift, I asked my coworker if he had seen anything similar. Since he was more experienced than me, I figured he might have seen the guy before. My coworker told me that he had never seen anybody like that. That night when I was alone again, the same creepy guy came in and did the same thing. He walked in the front door at around 10:30 p.m. and stood there silently. Several customers came in during that time, but I suppose it would not look as strange to them, since they were only in there for a minute or two. Just like last time, he left without any incident 5 minutes before close. Over my next few shifts, the same thing happened each and every time. I came to expect it. From time to time, I would try to talk to the guy, but he would never respond. He wouldn't even look at me. I stood behind the counter one night. The creepy guy was standing on the other side of the store as usual. I can't even describe how awkward it was, being alone with this guy night after night. We had probably spent over 10 hours together alone, collectively, since I started the job. Just like usual, he left a few minutes before closing time. After he left, I walked over to the front door and locked it. Then I spent the next half hour or so on my closing routine. I emptied the garbage cans and did a quick sweep of the floors. Then I emptied the cash register and got it ready for deposit on my way home. When I stepped out of the store, I looked out to see my car alone in the dark parking lot. I was parked on the far side, past the pumps. I started walking towards my car, and suddenly, I started to feel like I was being watched. Just then, someone ran out from the darkness and stood in front of me, blocking my car. It was that same guy from before, the one who just stood there in the store with me every night. As soon as I saw him, I ran back to the store, unlocked the door, and scurried inside. When I was in there, I locked the door and called my dad for help. While I was waiting, I looked out the large glass window at the front, and I could see that the guy was still standing in the exact spot where I last saw him. He hadn't moved. After about 10 minutes, my dad's car pulled up, and his headlights fell upon the guy. The guy's face was completely lit for a split second, and when that happened, he took off running. To this day, I have no idea where he went. That was the last time I ever worked at that gas station, and from then on, I refused to take any night shifts at my other jobs. The people you run into are just way too scary. I have no idea who that guy was, or what he wanted, but in my opinion, he was not all there, and I don't know what he was capable of. This story takes place one night when I stopped for gas on my way home from work. I worked at a restaurant, so I was usually there until late, sometimes after midnight. This time it was about 11:30 at night. I would pass this gas station every day on my way home from work, and I'm pretty sure it was open 24/7. The store part of the gas station was bigger than most. It was almost like a tiny grocery store, because it had a decent selection of food. Not just the junk food and snacks like some others. This place even had a tiny produce aisle. Because of that, I would often pick up some things there after filling up my car, since other places in the area were usually closed at the time. I was walking down the aisles of the store while my car was parked outside. I filled my basket with a few of the essentials that I always buy: bananas, eggs, and bread. Then I walked around for a while, trying to decide if there was anything else that I wanted. I eventually made my way to the till and paid for my gas, as well as the grocery items. Then I walked out the large glass door at the front of the store. I could see that my car was parked next to one of the pumps. The parking lot was dark, but the bright lights from the gas pumps were like a bright oasis. I started walking towards my car, and as I got closer, I could tell that there was somebody sitting in my back seat. I don't usually lock my doors when I go in, because it's usually pretty quick, but this time, I was in there for a while, longer than normal. Also, my car is pretty old, so you have to lock them all manually. I know it's not smart, but those are my excuses, so take it for what you will. I inched closer to get a look at the person. It appeared to be an older woman, hunched over. Her hair was covering most of her face, and the shade from the roof of my car formed a dark corner in the back seat where she was sitting, so it was hard to tell much about her. My first thought was that it was an elderly woman who wandered into my car, confused. I stood a few feet away from the car while I thought about the situation. I considered simply giving her a ride to wherever she was going. I'm always willing to help people in need, but some part of me thought that was not a good idea. After a minute or two, I decided to call the police. I hate to get the police involved for something like this, and I made sure that they knew it was not an emergency or anything. Also, I did not want to press any charges. When the police arrived, I talked to the officers for a few minutes. After that, they told me to wait by the building to give them some distance. I couldn't see much from there, and the bodies of the 2 police officers were blocking what little view I might have had. I could tell that they opened the back door of my car, and before I knew it, they had pulled the person out of the back seat and put her in handcuffs. I thought that was unnecessary, so I ran over shouting for them to stop. In my mind, it was just a confused old woman who wandered into my car by accident. But as I got closer, I could tell that it was not a woman at all. It was an older man, probably 50 or 60 years old, with long gray hair and several large tattoos on his face and hands. For some reason that I never figured out, he seemed to be wearing a hospital gown over his clothes. I stopped in my tracks when I realized that. Then one of the officers yelled at me to stay back. I backed up a few steps and continued to watch in disbelief. My heart sank when I noticed something. When the man was being frisked, I saw them remove a large hunting knife from under his clothes. He was definitely planning something for me, something that I wanted no part of. It's very scary to think that I almost got into the car with that guy sitting back there. Luckily, I made the right decision, and I survived to tell about it. This happened just over a month ago. I was hanging out at my friend Jaden's house with some other guys. There were 5 or 6 of us there. I lived kind of far away, but everyone else lived in his neighborhood. I borrowed my dad's car to get there. My friends all had a few drinks, but I had to drive, so I couldn't. At around midnight, we called it a night, and I hopped into the car and said goodbye to my friends. My dad always lets me borrow his car, but he asks that I put some gas in to make up for what I use. A fair rule. I was driving down one of the larger streets in my town. There were stores and restaurants on both sides. All were closed for the night, though. It was quite deserted. I noticed a gas station on the right, and I figured it was as good a place as any to fill up. I pulled into the farthest pump. As I got out, I noticed a car at the station. It was the only other one there. I looked over to it as I was filling up my car. It was dark blue, with tinted windows. I couldn't see anybody inside, but the headlights were on, so I figured someone was there. As I was getting back into the driver's seat, I saw the car pull up next to me. The front window rolled down. The driver was wearing a mask. I couldn't see his face. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It was really awkward. I tried to start my car and get out of there, but I fumbled with the ignition. I looked up and saw that the car was still there, waiting for me. I finally got my car started and began driving. After a few minutes, I looked back and I saw that the car was behind me. My first thought was to drive to the police station. That's what my mom always told me to do in a situation like this. I thought I remembered how to find it, but after a while, I found myself lost and the car was still on my tail. I felt like I was driving in circles, lost in the middle of nowhere. I tried to keep calm. The fear was overwhelming. I had meandered all the way into a very rural area. There were farm fields on either side, with tall corn stalks closing in on the road. I felt trapped, and I was completely alone with that guy behind me. I slowed my car and called 911. The operator answered. I tried to describe where I was, but all I could see was darkness. I couldn't see any landmarks or signs. The operator tried to help me, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, my headlights fell upon a large grain tower that had the name Miller painted on the side. I excitedly told the operator, and she seemed to think that it was enough for the police to find me. I kept driving for several more minutes. That's when I saw a flicker of light in the distance. It was a police car. I honked the horn, hoping that they would see me. The police car approached, and the other car fled. I felt really relieved when I noticed that. The police officer got out of his car and asked me if I was okay. I told him everything, and we talked for a few minutes. He asked me if I wanted to press charges, but I declined. I just wanted to get home and forget the whole thing. The car was gone anyway. I didn't know if they could find him, and if they did, he would have just lied and said nothing happened. When I finally got home, I collapsed on the couch and tried to calm down. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I was in a daze. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night, so I turned on the TV and tried to distract myself. Then I went into my room and played some video games. I ended up going to sleep when the sun was coming up. Weeks later, I was watching the news, and I saw a story about a man who had been attacked and robbed at a gas station. The description of the car and the driver matched the one that had followed me, and I'm pretty sure it was the same guy. It was a cold winter evening, and I was working at the gas station in my town. The gas station was a small one, with a few pumps, a small shop, and a restroom. I spent most of my time inside the shop, attending to customers and trying to keep warm. As the night grew darker, the gas station grew quieter. The occasional car would pull in to fill up on gas or grab a snack, but for the most part, it was just me, all alone. It wasn't until two men walked in. One was tall and thin, with a pale face and high cheekbones. The other was about average height, with long gray hair and a baseball hat. They both wore dirty jackets and pants, and their hair was unkempt. I tried to be polite, but I was wary of them. They asked me for directions to the nearest town. I pointed them in the right direction, hoping they would leave soon, but they lingered, eyeing me up and down, and asking me personal questions. I tried to be short with them, but they wouldn't take the hint. Finally, they bought some cigarettes and left, climbing into an old beat-up car parked outside. I breathed a sigh of relief as they drove away, but little did I know that my troubles were far from over. After my shift ended, I headed outside to wait for the bus. The night air was crisp, and my breath fogged up in front of me. Suddenly, that same old car, with those two men driving, pulled up beside me. They offered me a ride, but I refused, telling them that I preferred to wait for the bus. But they persisted, and started to make me feel really uncomfortable. That's when I noticed a look in their eyes. It was a look that sent shivers down my spine. I told them I was not interested, and then I walked away as fast as I could. I was a block away when I looked back. The car was still there, and I could also see that the bus was fast approaching. I ran to the nearest stop and jumped on just in time. I knew that something was not right about those guys. I thought about calling the police, but I decided against it, not wanting to make a fuss. Over the coming weeks, I noticed that car lurking around the gas station. They seemed to just circle the neighborhood, and I had no idea what they were doing. I try not to go out there alone when those guys are around, and so far, that seemed to help. This is a really scary story that happened to me. I was driving home from visiting family out of state. It was late and I was tired, but I had to keep going. The road stretched out before me like a black ribbon, and the only sound was the hum of my car engine. I never could listen to music while driving. I find it too distracting. I was lost in my thoughts when I saw a gas station up ahead. I decided to pull over and get some coffee and snacks to help me stay awake. As I stepped out of the car, I felt a chill in the air. The gas station was small and isolated, with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours." I walked inside, and I was immediately hit by the smell of gasoline and cigarettes. The store was dimly lit, with only a few fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. There was a man standing at the counter, with greasy hair and a stained t-shirt. He looked up as I walked in, and his eyes seemed to follow me as I made my way to the coffee machine. I poured myself a cup, then I grabbed a bag of chips and some beef jerky. I turned to leave, but the man was standing in front of me, blocking my way.
"Nice car you got there,"
he said, leering at me.
"Must have cost you a pretty penny."
I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This guy was creepy, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what he wanted. "Yeah, it's a rental," I lied, trying to push past him. But he wasn't budging. He was staring at me with a hungry look in his eyes, like a predator sizing up his prey.
"You know, I could help you out,"
he said, leaning closer.
"I know a shortcut that'll get you home faster."
That guy was really scaring me at this point. Something about him made my skin crawl. I never even told him where I was going, so how could he know if there was a shortcut? "Sorry, not interested," I said, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. He reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me closer to him. I could smell the stench of his breath, and I felt bile rising in my throat.
"Come on, man,"
he hissed.
"Don't be like that. Let me help you out."
I yanked my arm away and stumbled backwards. I could hear him laughing behind me as I ran out of the store and jumped into my car. I peeled out of that parking lot and back onto the highway. I was almost crying. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the man coming out of the gas station and getting into his own car. He was following me. I tried to lose him, taking sharp turns and weaving in and out of traffic, but he was right behind me, his headlights glaring in my mirror like the eyes of a demon. Suddenly, he swerved towards me, trying to run me off the road. I felt my car spin out of control, and I braced myself for impact, but somehow, I managed to regain control and sped away from him. I didn't stop until I reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. I stumbled into the lobby and begged for a room. I was pretty sure I had lost him. The clerk looked me over with a suspicious eye, but eventually gave me a key and pointed me towards my room. I entered and collapsed on the bed. I don't remember how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, before I finally fell asleep, but it was a long time. The last time I checked the clock, it was 4 in the morning. I woke up at 6, and I felt even more exhausted. I poked my head out of the room and scanned the area for that car. It was not there. I was relieved and got back into my car and drove the rest of the way home. I never saw that car again, and I never told anyone what happened until now, and I'll probably never talk about it again either. I worked at a gas station until my late 20s. This is about the scariest thing that ever happened while I worked there. I had gotten the job while I was in high school, and I kept doing it afterwards because there was not much else I could find. The nights paid a little better, so I always did that shift. I had been working there for years, serving customers without any significant events or disturbances. It was about 3 in the morning, and the store was empty, as was typical for that time of night. There was rarely more than a single customer in the store at a time for the duration of my shift. It was a cold night, and there was a light drizzle. I looked up to see a man walking towards the door. His face was obscured by a hooded sweatshirt. He pushed the door open and walked in. He looked suspicious, and I got nervous as he entered the store.
"Hey, buddy,"
he said, looking at me briefly. I got a quick look at his face, but not quite enough so that I could describe it. I tried to keep my cool, nodding silently. Then I went back to whatever I was reading, but something about him made me worried, and I couldn't help but feel that something was about to go wrong. He walked around the store aimlessly for several minutes. I was peeking at him periodically, nervous that he would try something. I could tell he wasn't going to buy anything. Our store didn't have the best selection. There was no way it would take anybody that long to make a decision. The tension built for another minute or two. Then the man walked up to the counter.
"Give me all the money in the cash register,"
he whispered. I was shocked, and I was unable to comprehend what was happening. I had never been robbed before, and the idea of someone threatening me with violence was beyond my wildest nightmares. "Okay, no problem," I said timidly. I opened the register and handed the money over. And then, just as quickly as he came in, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a phantom. I stood there in a trance. I had triggered the alarm while he was still in the store, so I knew it would not be long before the police arrived. They walked in the front door of the store, and I was still standing there terrified. I told them what happened, and then we looked at the security footage. It was all there, but there was not a clear shot of his face. The officers were confident that they would find the guy, based on what they had, though. I found out the next day that the guy was tracked down and arrested. He was still wearing the same clothes. Not the smartest criminal. I'm Sophie, and I used to work at a KFC in a large retail complex. It was open till midnight most nights, and it was the last place open of all the businesses in the area. So when my late shifts were done, there was always a really ominous feeling in the air. The deserted parking lot gave me the creeps. I worked there part-time when I was in college. On one particular night, I was closing the restaurant with a few other coworkers. Just to add some context, we were all girls, and there were 3 of us, including my manager. We turned off the outside lights and started to tidy up the kitchen and dining area. When we were about to leave, the restaurant phone rang. It was an eerie sound since we had all just turned off the lights. The only light source was a dim glow coming from the kitchen. My manager picked up the phone, and we all stood around her trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. We heard the crackle of a man's voice on the other end of the line. He said,
"I see you in there,"
among other things, but all I could make out was that. I looked around at my coworkers. We were all visibly frightened, but we tried to stay calm, hoping it was just a prank call. We would get prank calls from time to time, but not usually this late. It was past bedtime for most of the kids that would usually prank us. My manager tried to ask the man who he was and what he wanted, but he didn't answer. When my manager hung up the phone, we heard a loud thud coming from the front door. We all jumped, and my manager quickly ran to the front to check what was happening. She looked out the large window, and I followed. There was a man, wearing a plaid button-down shirt, standing outside the door, with his back to us. We couldn't see his face, but he looked like a neat and tidy guy. Not the type you would expect. His hair was thinning at the top, and his hands were in his pockets. My manager quickly made sure the door was locked, and told us to call the police. I dialed 911, and within minutes, a police car arrived. We could see the flashing red and blue lights in the dining room where we waited. As we watched through the window, we could see the police officer approach the man and started talking to him. The man turned around, and we could see his face for the first time. He had a stern expression on his face, and he looked right at me. The police officer spoke to the man for a few minutes. We couldn't tell what they were saying, but it looked like the officer was telling him to leave. The man simply walked away. Then the police officer came into the restaurant to talk to us. He asked us if we knew the man, or if we'd seen him before. We all shook our heads, and we said we had no idea who he was. That was when the police officer told us something really creepy. He told me that the man said he was Sophie's father, and he was there to pick her up after work. I told him that was not my father, and that I'd never seen the man before. I had no idea how he even knew my name. It must have been a sick joke, I thought. After the police took off, we locked up the restaurant and left. We were all really shaken up, and we couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. The next day, we talked to the other employees who'd worked the previous late shift, but none of them had seen the man or heard anything strange. It was like the man only appeared to us. For the next few weeks, we were all on edge whenever we closed. We made sure to double-check all the locks, and always checked outside before leaving. We never saw that man again. Looking back on that night, I still get chills thinking about what could have happened if we'd gone outside. I still wonder what he wanted, and why he said what he said to the officer. I was disappointed that more couldn't have been done about that guy. I was creeped out about it for a long time, and I wish they could have done something to keep him away from me. I used to be a cleaner for a local shopping mall. I worked at night when the stores were all closed and the shoppers had gone home. It was a quiet job, mostly just me and sometimes a few others. This time it was just me. I would always listen to music or podcasts on my phone while I worked, otherwise the boredom would be too much to handle. One night, I was mopping the floor of a narrow corridor leading to the bathroom. There was an exit nearby and a large glass door. I heard a tapping sound behind me. I turned around and saw a man dressed in a police uniform standing at the glass door. He looked straight at me and then said,
"Let me in. It's an emergency."
I hesitated for a minute. I was shocked to see another person here. It was 1:30 a.m., and I knew no police officer would be at the mall at this hour, especially not tapping on a glass door to be let in. But something about the man's urgent tone made me feel like I should at least hear him out. "Why do you need to come in?" I asked, my hand hovering over the lock.
"There's been a break-in at the jewelry store. I need to get in and secure the scene,"
he replied. The jewelry store was one of the most valuable stores in the mall. They certainly had a ton of expensive stuff. But if someone had broken in, then I would have thought I would notice. I did have my headphones in, but it's hard to believe that I wouldn't notice. That, and I was pretty sure the jewelry store stashes away all their expensive stuff at night. I didn't think you could just break in and steal stuff. I wasn't buying his story. Something didn't feel right. The man's demeanor was off, too friendly and relaxed for someone claiming to be responding to a break-in. And there was just one officer. Usually there'd be at least a few of them. I didn't even see the guy's car. "I'm sorry, I can't let you in," I said firmly. Then I pulled out my phone to call the police. The man's smile disappeared, replaced by a scowl. He began to bang on the glass door, demanding to be let in, but I knew better than to unlock the door for a stranger in the middle of the night. As I spoke to the police dispatcher, the man eventually gave up and disappeared out of sight. I told them what happened, describing the man and his police uniform as best I could. They assured me that they would send someone to check it out, and then I went to the main entrance to wait. Not more than a few minutes later, 2 police cars arrived. One of the officers stepped out of his car, and as soon as I saw him, I noticed that their uniforms did not match the guy I saw earlier. At that moment, I knew I made the right choice by turning him away. I talked to the police for a few minutes, but they told me there was no report of a robbery at the mall. Further confirmation of what I already knew. The rest of the night passed without incident. I finished my shift as usual, leaving the mall at 6 a.m. As I drove home, I thought about what that guy could have wanted. I figure he just wanted to rob the place, but what would he have done to me? It wouldn't have been good. When I was 20 years old, I used to work at a large grocery store near my house. I was still living with my parents, but I was saving for my own place. The store was open 24/7, and I worked the late shift. The place was always really empty at night. It was just me and another guy stocking shelves. Then there was a single cashier. It was a huge store with about 10 checkouts, so most of the place was really empty. Most nights the only excitement came from restocking the shelves and dealing with the occasional shoplifter. That was really rare though. One night a man came in, and he asked me some strange questions. He was older and had thinning hair. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I initially thought he was homeless, but when he came close, then I thought he probably wasn't. He asked me if we sold any products that could be used to make explosives. I was taken aback by his question, but I told him that we didn't carry anything like that. He tried to play it off like he was joking, and I actually believed him at first. I shrugged it off as a weird encounter and went back to my work, but later that night, I noticed the same man standing in the parking lot, staring at the store. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing there and watching. You encounter all kinds of people at night, but this one really got to me. I tried to make excuses for it. Maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone. But when I took my break and looked out the window, I saw the man was still standing there, watching the store. It was weird. The next night, the man came back. This time he came into the store and asked me some more strange questions. He wanted to know if we had any security cameras, or if the store had any security personnel working. I told him we did, and asked if there was anything else I could help him with. He turned around and walked away without saying anything else. He lingered in the store for a while longer, and then left without buying anything. During my break that night, I looked out the window and saw the same man standing in the parking lot, looking in. I ignored him as best I could, and finished my shift for the night. I was worried that he would still be there when I left for the night, but thankfully, he was gone. I didn't know where he went, or if he was still there, but I was glad I couldn't see him at least. Nothing happened for the next few days. He didn't show. But one night the next week, something strange happened. I finished my shift at 11 p.m. and started walking to my car. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the same man walking behind me. The parking lot was dark. There were a few other cars around, some customers, and some were probably my coworkers. There were no other people though, just me and that guy. He had a wild look in his eyes, and he was muttering to himself. He got close enough that I could smell him. He started shouting at me and accusing me of weird things, like that I was spying on him. I obviously wasn't. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He pushed me against my car and held me there. He was surprisingly strong. I thought I was going to die right then and there in the parking lot. I managed to squirm free though, and ran back to the store. The guy chased me for a bit, but he was really slow. When I got in, I told the cashier to call the police. When they arrived, the man was gone. I described him to them, and they seemed to know who he was. It turned out he'd been in trouble before. It wasn't the first time he'd attacked somebody. The experience really scared me, but I kept working there for another year and a half after that. I didn't see the man again after that night, though. He never came back to the store, and I was really happy about that. At the time that this incident happened, I had been working at McDonald's for several months. The hours were long and the work was boring. Most nights were uneventful, with only a few customers trickling in here and there. The weekends were usually a little more rowdy, though. A lot of drunk people coming in, and fights would happen often. They were usually not a big deal, but one time a pretty scary thing happened. It was a Saturday night, and I was behind the counter when two customers walked in. At first they seemed like any other customers, just two guys looking for a late night snack. It seemed like they were friends at first, but as they approached the counter, I could sense something was off. They were clearly angry at each other. I didn't care to pay attention to what they were saying, but I could tell they were mad. They continued arguing, and before I knew it, they were shouting at each other. I tried to intervene and calm them down, but it was no use. They were both so angry, and they didn't even seem to hear me. I walked out from behind the counter to try to keep them apart. That was a big mistake, though. Suddenly, one of them pulled out a knife. I had never seen anything like that before, and I had no idea what to do. I walked back behind the counter and called the police, but the men were already in a full-blown fight. I went back out there, still on the phone with the police. I went to try to break them up again, but they were really going at it. I couldn't stop them. I tried to keep my distance, but as I backed away, I felt something sharp scrape against my arm. I looked down and saw that I'd been cut by a knife. It wasn't a deep cut, but still. Then the police arrived and managed to break them up. They arrested both men and took them away, but the damage had already been done. The restaurant was a mess, and there was blood dripping down my arm. The customers who had been in the restaurant at the time fled, and the only people left were the police and me. Two of my coworkers were still in the back. I took the rest of the night off and went to the hospital. Soon after, I quit my job. I couldn't bear the thought of working there anymore, not after what happened. To be honest, I was planning on quitting before that, but this was the last straw. I would have probably stayed for another few months otherwise, but because of what happened, I quit right away. I had to get tested for all kinds of diseases because of the cut to my arm. Luckily, they all came back negative. I worked at a gas station for the last 5 years. For most of the time, I worked the overnight shift, which was from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m. I didn't mind it, but it wasn't really my choice. That was all they had available at the time, and I needed a job. I did eventually move to the day shift, but that was just because my circumstances changed. I started going to school, and I couldn't stay up all night falling asleep in class. If it weren't for that, then I would have just kept doing it, because it was a lot easier. There were barely any customers, and hardly any work to do. The pay was a little better as well. I saw many strange things working the overnight shift over the years, but this is about an extremely creepy and weird thing that happened to me. Our gas station was on the side of a small highway that was not very busy. We were the only gas station for many miles, and there wasn't much else around there. No stores or other businesses. Surrounding the gas station was nothing but woods, but there were some farm fields not far away as well. There were a few houses around there too, but the closest one was probably 20 miles away. It was quite isolated. I got to work around 15 minutes early and parked my car at the front. It was already dark out, but the lights on the outside of the building were bright. The gas station was like a little bubble of daylight in a sea of darkness. The hum from the fluorescent bulbs was loud as I walked past them. I could see swarms of moths gathering around there. I walked into the gas station and saw Carlos, who was one of my coworkers. His shift was just ending, but I liked to show up a little early so that we could chat. He would sometimes stay a little late with me before taking off. Once Carlos left, I did most of my work for the night. I was able to get through it really quickly because not a single customer came in for the first 2 hours of my shift. After that, I didn't really have anything to do other than cover the cash and help customers if they had trouble with the pumps. Since the pumps had payment processors built in, there usually wasn't much for me to do. Nothing much happened for the next few hours. I was doing a crossword puzzle while listening to music on my phone. I had only one earbud in, just in case a customer came in. That way I would hear the door open. That was when I heard 3 loud bangs coming from outside. It sounded like someone was banging on our back door. That was incredibly strange, because I didn't see any cars pull up, and Carlos was long gone. I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard one more bang. I knew I had to check what it was, so I turned off my music and put my phone in my pocket. Then I walked to the front door. When I stepped out, I confirmed that mine was in fact the only car there. I continued around to the back of the store. It was well lit all the way around. When I turned the corner to the back, I saw it. A man was standing there facing away from me. The bright fluorescent lights covered him in that artificial glow. He had gray hair sticking out from under a baseball hat. Other than that, he wore a black t-shirt and shorts. It was summer, but the night still got pretty cold, so that was weird too. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I said. He didn't move. I waited another few seconds, and then I asked him again. No response. He was still facing away from me, so I walked around trying to make eye contact with him. I kept a lot of distance though, because I was kind of scared already. When I made it to the other side, I could almost see the man's face, but his head was pointing down. I took 2 steps closer to him, and when I did, the man's head jerked up towards me. He had the creepiest smile I've ever seen. After that happened, I shuffled back a good 10 or 20 feet, still looking at the guy. Once I put some distance between us, the man turned around and walked into the dense woods that backed onto the gas station. Once he was away from the lights, he was in the pitch darkness. I couldn't see where he went after that, and I had no idea where he could have gone. Like I said, there were no other cars, and that place was so remote that you couldn't walk there. It would be a really long walk anyway. After he was gone, I went back into the store and tried to comprehend what had just happened. I honestly didn't know what to do. I guess I could have called the police, but for what? I guess he was banging on the door. That might be illegal, but it seemed like a stretch. I could have called to do some kind of a wellness check, but at the time I was so confused that I didn't know. I finished my shift as usual, and then I went home. When I woke up the following afternoon, I checked my phone. I found out on the news that there was a missing person reported that morning. The description didn't match the man I saw. He was at least 50, but the missing person was a 22-year-old guy. I called the police anyway to report what I saw, since I thought it might be connected. The police said they would look into it, but I never heard anything back. I still don't know if the two incidents were connected, but I think it was too much of a coincidence if they weren't. Something sinister happened that night, and I have no idea how close I came to being a part of it. When this happened, I was around 18 years old. I had my driver's license, but I hadn't saved up for a car yet, so I was still driving my mom's minivan whenever she would let me use it. I lived around 30 minutes outside the city, but I would go into the downtown area often with my friends. There wasn't much to do in my neighborhood, so my parents were usually willing to let me use one of their cars. I was going to a concert one night with my friend Brad, and I was driving. On the way home, we needed to fill up the van, so we stopped at a gas station that was downtown, near the concert venue. I pulled into one of the empty pumps. They were all empty. It was midnight on a Tuesday, so there were not many people out. I got out of the van and started filling up the tank. Brad went into the store to get a drink and some snacks. I looked over to the store as Brad walked in. There was a man standing next to the door. He was around 45 years old with gray hair and wrinkled skin. He wore a brown sweatshirt with some kind of a logo on it. After Brad went in, the man followed. Once I was done with the gas, I pulled away from the pump and into one of the parking spots off to the side. Then I waited for my friend. A minute later, I saw Brad approaching, but he wasn't alone. That man was with him. I could tell by the look on Brad's face that he was uncomfortable. When they got to the car, Brad said the man needed a ride, but I could tell he wanted me to say no. I made up some excuse about how my parents would be mad. The man had a mean look on his face, but before I knew it, he pulled a knife and placed it against Brad's abdomen.
"Unlock the door and do what I say,"
the man grumbled. I tried to stall. I didn't want to let that psycho into my van, but I couldn't leave Brad alone with him either. I looked over to my friend to see tears flowing down his face. He was scared to death. Just when I was about to let him in, another man walked by towards the store. I made eye contact with him and mouthed the words, "Help me." He looked away, then he looked back with concern. I was sure that he noticed. I tried to stall some more. I told the man with the knife that I would let him in, but that the door was jammed. He obviously didn't believe me and pressed the knife harder at Brad. Brad started crying louder. Another long minute passed when sirens began to emerge from the distance. When the man heard that, he took off running. I didn't even see which way he went. The police were able to catch him that night, and Brad was taken to the hospital. There was a deep gash in his side from that knife. I had no idea at the time that the man was actually stabbing him. I thought it was more of a threat, but no. Brad was standing there that whole time, with a knife literally in his abdomen. I gained a new respect for him after that. I would have absolutely crumbled, but he kept it together. Overall, it was the worst night of our lives so far. Brad got it a lot worse than I did, but I'm sure it would have been worse if we let that psycho into the car. We may not have lived to tell the story. I began working at a gas station during my last year of high school. It was my first job, because work was hard to find in my area. Many of my friends were still not able to find work, even after we graduated, so I was pretty happy to have the job, even though the pay was low. One catch was that I had to work the late shift, not overnight, but I started at 5 p.m. and went until midnight usually. After that, my boss's son Andre would take over. He didn't mind the overnight shift because he would stay up all night gaming anyway. I had been working there for a few months, and nothing much happened. It was a boring job, but it was also easy. They would give me some basic cleaning work to do, and then I would have to stock some shelves. That would never take me long though, so I would end up reading books on my phone for at least a few hours every shift. There was a back area at the store where I could hide out. If the door opened, then I would go out and help the customer. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to stand behind the counter the whole time. There was also a feed from the security cameras back there, so I could keep an eye on the store. One night at around 11 p.m., I was sitting in the back reading a book on my phone. It was a quiet night so far, but then I heard the door open. I looked up at the security screen and saw a man walk in. No problem, I thought. I put my phone in my pocket and walked out into the store area. I immediately noticed that the man didn't have a car. He came on foot. That was kind of strange, but not that unheard of. The guy was around 25, with blue athletic shorts and a dirty t-shirt that was at least 2 sizes too big. He had a patchy blonde beard and shaggy blonde hair. He just walked around aimlessly in the store for 20 excruciating minutes, and then he left. Neither of us said a word to the other during that time. Later that night, Andre came in to take over. I told him about that guy and mentioned how creeped out I was. Andre told me that he knew the guy from high school and said that his name was Craig. He also told me that the guy got pretty heavily into drugs, so Andre didn't talk to him anymore. He'd had to ask the guy to leave a few times before, but didn't have any problems with him beyond that. Andre was not able to explain why he came to the store all the time, because he never tried to steal anything before. He would just come in and walk around. On my next shift, the same thing happened. At around 11 p.m., that same guy, Craig, came in and loitered for about 20 minutes or half an hour. Then he left without saying a word. It was creepy as hell, and I wanted him to leave. I thought that if I kicked him out, though, he might get angry and try something, so I never did anything. When I traded off with Andre, I told him about Craig again. He didn't have any answers for me. He said I should just ignore it, because the guy was probably harmless. On my next shift, however, it was around 11, and I was expecting a visit from Craig as usual. I was out in the aisles stocking some shelves when the door opened. This time, 2 guys walked into the store. They were both wearing full masks, covering their faces, but I was pretty sure one of them was Craig. The other guy was bigger, at least 6'2" and huge. He wore a black jacket and black pants. As soon as I laid eyes on these guys, I knew I was in trouble. I should mention that it was before lockdowns, so masks were not normal at all. They didn't waste any time. Both men walked over to me. The larger one pulled out a gun. If I was behind the counter, then I would have been able to trip the alarm, but I was steps away, which might as well have been miles. They forced me to the register and made me give them all the money, which I would estimate was less than $300. The big guy then demanded my phone. As soon as I gave it to him, he smashed it on the floor right in front of me. After that, they looted the store for a few minutes and then left. As soon as they did, I hit the alarm and waited for the police. They were there in minutes. I told them that I knew one of the robbers. Andre came in and gave them a full description of Craig, including his last name. He was arrested that night, and I heard he gave up his accomplice in minutes. Both of them did time in jail for what they did to me. The most messed up thing is that they got out, and I still see Craig around town. One time he even tried to talk to me as if we were friends. I told that guy to F off, and I hope I never see him again. I look younger than I really am, thanks to my height of 5'0", and due to the fact that I don't age like most girls. I only just remembered this story when I was talking to my mom. February 11th was the night of the Valentine's dance I was attending at my school. I had worn my mother's golden prom dress. My friend Anne had a white and pink dress. This is important information. Anne's dad was our chaperone, so after we got into the car, he drove us to a gas station. He asked us both to go in and pay for the gas, but since Anne had no idea what to do, I did it. Upon approaching the counter, the cashier greeted us by saying,
"Where are you pretty ladies headed to?"
Since he had a bit of a broken English tone, I tried to be polite and replied, "We just got back from a dance." Keep in mind that it was around 12 in the morning at this point.
"Oh, I should have gone. Maybe I could find me some pretty ladies like you."
He had a smirk on his face. Anne and I were already freaked out, so we just excused ourselves and poked around the store. While we did, we were whispering about how creepy he was. I caught him peeking over the counter to us multiple times. Suddenly he started talking again.
So, how old are you pretty ladies? About 18, I guess.
We were nowhere near 18. We might have looked a little bit older because of our heels and the makeup we wore, but that's it. I'm older than my friend by a year, but I was still 14, and she was 13. Our birthdays were in just a few days. Mine came before hers. Hers was one day after mine. And began to tell him our ages until I spoke up and said, "Actually, we gotta go." And I dragged her outside. We got out of there, and we never saw him again. In June of 2010, I got a job working in nuclear security. I loved it and made good money. I was contract security. Most of the people were great and fun to work with. In September of 2012, I found out I was pregnant. This is important later. The security company I worked for hired several new guards in 2012. One of them I'll call H. H was a rather small, thin guy in his mid-40s, and he seemed nice at first. That is until I left the day shift to work nights. We would work from 5:30 p.m. until 6 a.m. Everything seemed fine at first, no problems. As the nights went on, H would start smarting off to me for no reason. Basically, he started acting like a jerk. I have no idea why this man was being so mean. I'm a Christian, and decided to kill him with kindness. I had found that he and his wife were getting divorced, and he was having a hard time with it. I felt bad for him, because I had 2 divorces in my 3 marriages. Whenever I'd ask H a question, he would scream at me over the radio that we carried, or I'd be walking to a new post, and if he was already walking by, he would always run into me hard, knocking me away. I forgot to mention that I'm 5'11" and not a pushover. I really thought he was having a hard time and taking it out on me. At this job, if they were short on people, they would force overtime. This night, H was forced to work on the weekend on a different crew. I felt bad for him having to work on the weekend, because he was supposed to visit with his kids. I called and took his shift so that he could see his kids. The next time I worked with H, he brought me a letter from a so-called friend and asked me to rewrite it so he could send it to his wife. He then apologized to me for his rudeness. I really didn't want to, and tried to tell him nicely no. But H insisted, so I reluctantly agreed. That's when he started telling me about his wife and how crazy she was. He tried to get her some help. He said she wasn't stable enough to get full custody of their kids. A couple of nights later, he started telling me things that he would love to do to her. "I really want to strangle her and watch the life drain out of her," he would say. If I decided to kill someone, no one would ever figure out where the bullet came from. Then I could get a plane and take my kids somewhere where no one would ever find us. H then looked at me with very cold eyes and told me, "If you ever tell anyone what I said," and I quote, "I'll cut your heart out and watch you bleed." At this point, I was scared beyond belief. I went to my supervisor and told him about the threat. They pulled H's security clearance. When they did that, he glared at me with the scariest look I've ever seen. My boss told me to make a police report, so I documented what happened. It turns out that H had been arrested for harassment of some older woman at Publix. I still don't know how he got his job in security with that record. In January of 2013, I had taken a layoff because I was considered high risk. I am type 2 diabetic. I had gotten in touch with his wife and told her about the threats he made to her. Later, I got a subpoena to testify at court. When H found out about it, he started following me. He went to my husband's job looking around. Then I started getting phone calls where you could hear someone breathing, but never said anything. H started calling the manager of my apartment, asking which unit I lived in, what my vehicle looked like, and so on. This went on for about 2 months, scaring me to death. In March, I went to court, and when he saw me, he grinned an evil grin like I've never seen before. I wasn't called to testify, and the stalking stopped. I later found out that he had been arrested for breaking into the house where his wife was staying, and he had several firearms in his possession that he wasn't supposed to have. When his wife moved to another house and went shopping, she came back and saw her home was on fire. H was in the driveway, grinning and laughing, while the firefighters were trying to put it out. "I guess you'll remember to turn off the coffee maker next time," he said. I've only seen him once since then. For 3 months I was absolutely terrified of him. I certainly hope that I never see him again. I worked nights at a gas station in my town. It was not far from my apartment, and therefore I was able to walk to and from work most days, at least in the summer. It could be pretty creepy walking at night, especially because my neighborhood has a bad crime problem. I have many stories to back that up, and this is one of them. The gas station was along a quiet road. Its neon sign glowed brightly against the dark night sky. It was a modest establishment, with a small convenience store filled with snacks, drinks, and various other items. The gas pumps were well in view when I was standing behind the counter. As the night settled in, I was pretty bored. You can only scroll on social media for so long. Not more than 10 customers had come in the whole night, and it was over 5 hours so far. It was 3 a.m. Behind the counter, I sat on a stool, my eyes heavy from the long hours of the night shift. I stared at the rows of shelves neatly stocked. I had gotten all my work done in the first hour of my shift. On that particular night, the atmosphere seemed unusually still. There were no customers in sight. I glanced out into the parking lot and saw a car parked in the corner, just beyond the pumps. It seemed out of place. It was a large SUV, black, I think, but it was hard to tell in the darkness. I strained my eyes to get a better look. I wasn't suspicious yet. There just wasn't anything more interesting to do. What I witnessed next was terrifying, though. 2 burly men forcibly approached it, carrying another man who seemed to be struggling. They shoved the man into the back of the SUV. My heart skipped a beat, and a rush of adrenaline hit me. In a state of shock, I didn't know what to do, although I know I should have dialed 911, or at least tripped the alarm. Before I could do either, one of the men glanced up. We locked eyes through the store window. Without a moment's hesitation, the man abruptly stormed into the store. His heavy footsteps echoed across the linoleum floor. He was a big guy, at least 6'2" and muscular looking, but also slightly overweight. He had a double chin, but looked strong. I'm sure he could break me in half if he wanted to. I'm a 5'7" guy, and about 120 pounds. He approached the counter, not even trying to seem friendly. He began interrogating me about what I had seen. At this point, I was way too scared to hit the alarm. I didn't think I could do it without him noticing, even though it's foot activated. I denied seeing anything, hoping to deflect his suspicions. The tension in the air was palpable, but I think he believed me. I was really terrified, but I must have done a decent job of not showing it. My guess is that the man thought it was too dark, so that I didn't see anything. After several long seconds, the man's gaze loosened, and he begrudgingly left the store. I watched out the window as the SUV drove away. My thoughts were with whoever the man was in the back. I didn't have much time to help him, so I called the police and reported what happened. I waited anxiously for them. Luckily, no new customers came in. When they finally arrived, I greeted the officers. Without wasting any time, they checked out our security footage. However, the car had managed to park just out of range of the gas station's cameras, leaving no concrete evidence to follow. Additionally, I was not able to get the license plate, or even a very good description of the SUV. I gave them a description of the man, but that was it. The officers waited with me for a few hours, in case the men came back. After I clocked out, I began my walk home on foot. My senses were heightened, and my mind was still reeling from the encounter. I was pretty creeped out for a while. I regretted not calling an Uber, even though it was a short walk. When I was over halfway home, a car slowly pulled up beside me. Other than that, the street was pretty much empty. I looked over and I was pretty sure it was the SUV from before. When the window rolled down, that was confirmed. The men inside the car offered me a ride, their words laced with an unsettling charm. I tried to pretend I didn't recognize them. With a shaking voice, I declined and kept walking. I looked forward, trying to pretend they were not there, but they were. They were following me slowly down the street. Without warning, the vehicle stopped, and one of the men got out. His eyes locked onto me like a predator, eyeing its prey. I looked back, and panic consumed me. It was the big guy from before. I sprinted away, looking back every few seconds. Like I said, the guy was big, therefore I was able to outrun him pretty easily. He was only chasing me for less than a minute. Even though he was no match for me on foot, I knew that if he caught me, I would be done. The stakes were high. A single slip could have been the end of me. I called the police again, but they were never able to catch the men. I quit my job at the gas station after this incident, because I was too scared to do that shift again. Unfortunately, this is not the only incident of that kind that happened to me. It's a really dangerous job, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I used to work as a security guard at a retail building in the heart of the city. It was on a side street, well away from the commotion of the city's nightlife. I wouldn't have it any other way. I was a student at the time, and I would go out sometimes, but the shift went by faster when I could be alone, without any distractions. I would use that time to read or play games on my phone. It was a pretty easy and boring job mostly, but one night something happened that I can't explain. It made me question everything. I was sitting in the security office on my phone. In front of me were several computer monitors with the security camera's feed. I looked up at them now and then, but they were really no different than still images most of the time. Out of nowhere, I started to hear a strange noise, like somebody walking around upstairs. It was late and I was tired, so I thought it might have been my imagination. I was curious though, so I decided to closely monitor the security cameras. I looked up from my phone and watched the monitors, trying to detect any movement on the screens. I scanned through the feeds, and I caught sight of a figure, a shadowy silhouette, lurking on the second-floor hallway. It moved with an eerie fluidity, appearing to disappear in the dimly lit corridor. Once it was gone for good. I couldn't find it on any of the other cameras, even though there was another, with an angle that should have shown the area where it was. This was no hallucination. There was somebody in that building. I was sure of it. The sound and then this. Gathering my composure, I swiftly reached for my phone and dialed the police. I explained what I saw. Within minutes, they arrived. They scoured the building, searching every floor and every hallway for any sign of that mysterious intruder. However, to my surprise, there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I could tell the police thought I was imagining things, and to be honest, I couldn't blame them. Especially because we could not find the footage where I saw the figure. I almost started to question it myself. It was so real, though. I started to question my own sanity, desperately trying to find a rational explanation for what I saw. The police left and I was alone again. As the clock ticked on, I heard a sharp crash. It was the sound of glass breaking through the building. Panic gripped me as I quickly switched to the security camera displaying the second-floor area. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. A broken window on the second floor. Clear evidence of an intruder. It was real. I was right all along. I dialed the police once again and gave them an update. They assured me that help was on the way, and I waited anxiously. I had no idea who was up there with me, or where he was. When the police finally arrived, they seemed somewhat annoyed with me. They must have thought I was crazy. However, when they saw the window, their tone changed. They called for backup. The whole building was locked down, and again they found nothing. No sign of an intruder, apart from the broken window. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Perhaps the intruder jumped out of the window, but it was the second floor, and it led to a paved alley. Nobody could make that jump without being seriously hurt. There was nothing stolen from the building either. There's no explanation that makes very much sense. If not for the broken window, then maybe I would still think I was crazy. During my unit's last deployment cycle, I went to Japan. I was in the Marine Corps Infantry, and my company had the chance to go from Okinawa to South Korea for a training exercise. It lasted roughly a month. Upon returning to Camp Schwab on Okinawa, our packed-out supplies were shipped back in 2 shipping containers called Connex boxes. Until the boxes could be unloaded and inventoried, an armed guard had to be posted to make sure nobody tampered with our gear. Things such as blank ammunition and snowshoes were kept in the boxes, and it wasn't cheap. The watch always had to be 2 guys from the same platoon together, just in case anything happened and there was an emergency. However, they only gave us 1 rifle with 1 magazine of live ammunition. I got assigned one of the worst shifts, 1 a.m. through 3 a.m., but I didn't really care because we had the next day off due to a holiday, and I was buddied up with a good friend of mine. His name was Long, and we had frequently hung out together. To get to this motor pool, we had to start walking 15 minutes early, to show up 15 minutes prior. All the vets reading this will know what I mean. Anyway, we were completely lost, and we made a wrong turn going out the side of the base zone and into the training area. We walked about 120 meters up this giant hill that eventually goes to a shooting range, and we found a lit cigarette on the road, still smoldering. Nobody was even supposed to be out there in the training area, so we quickly connected our path and re-entered the base. We felt creeped out that someone was out there in the dark alone smoking. We eventually ended up finding the motor pool. When we arrived, Long and I were shocked to see the military hadn't screwed us over for once. We saw the Marines that we were relieving hanging out of the doors of a JLTV left for us to sit in. A JLTV is basically an armored-up replacement for a Humvee. However, our replacements' faces were pale. One Lance Corporal stared blankly for a minute and said, "What the hell, man? That's not funny. And you know it's not. I could have shot you." I was puzzled and said, "What do you mean? We got mixed up and walked into the training zone." He just looked perplexed at this point, and then the other Lance Corporal spoke up and said, "Then who was it?" calling for a corpsman, and then violently shaking the fence of the motor pool. "We aren't stupid, and I'm not even mad. I just want to know how you got through vegetation that thick. The only other way over to that side of the fence is that hole." He gestured to a gaping hole next to the JLTV. "We would have seen you walk past," he said. We explained our every move, and he finally believed us. They proceeded to remove the magazine from the rifle and made sure it was clear before handing it off. After I received it, I promptly popped the mag back in, and we said our goodbyes. I was supposed to tell him if there was anything else, as he wrote it up. We were going to report it to our platoon sergeant in the morning. I hopped into the passenger seat, while Long hopped into the driver's seat. We got to talking. After what seemed like forever, he started to fall asleep. I let him do it, since it was only us, and I wasn't tired at all. Not long after that, I swear I saw a movement, but I didn't clearly see anything. And Okinawa has way too many stray cats, so I passed it off. Kind of on edge, something had changed in the air. It felt as if something was terribly wrong, or like I was witnessing something terrible, but saw nothing. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice say, "Hey, Marine," and it was getting close to the time that our replacements would be showing up. Figuring it was them, I woke Long up, and we hopped out of the vehicle. What happened next was the most insane thing I've ever witnessed in my life. Even in typing this, I feel as if maybe we both had some extreme mass hallucination. Emerging from the bushes, and through that hole, was a man. A Marine at that, but he was not one of us. He had no weapon, but he held an old helmet in a bandaged hand that looked like maybe it was missing a few fingers. There was blood on his face and all over his uniform. Not the uniform we were wearing, but an old one from the World Wars. His pants were absolutely shredded, and he was cut to heck. He looked like he had just full-fledged pushed through hell itself. At this point, we were both just awestruck. He glanced at his arm and elbow, which had a nasty slice in it, and then he looked at Long. He said two things. The first was, "Can I get one of those?" and pointed at Long's cargo pocket. Long only had his cigarettes in that pocket, so he instinctively grabbed the pack and pulled them out. He nervously said, "These?" The man just nodded, so Long pulled out a cigarette and handed it to him. The mysterious bloody figure, standing over us, just lit his cigarette and kind of grunted a thanks. He turned away, limping through the hole back into the jungle. We heard him pushing through the bushes, getting farther until it faded to nothing. As soon as our replacements arrived, we told them everything, and they laughed in our faces. We agreed that we must have made it up in our heads, but when we woke up the next morning and went down to the chow hall together, Long was just nervously staring at me. I broke the ice and asked him what was wrong. He said, "That pack of cigarettes last night was brand new. I woke up this morning, and only one cigarette was gone. It's the one I pulled out when you know what happened. It actually happened. The cigarette is gone." This has been a few years now, and I've only told a few people. Most just claim it's fake, but I have a nephew now who just got back from Okinawa, and completely unknown to him, this happened to me. He came to me and said, "You're never going to believe what happened to my friend that had to work as a gate guard." I said, "Let me guess. A Marine from World War II needed a smoke before going back to work, right?" His jaw dropped, and he said, "How do you know?" I just shrugged and said, "Lucky guess." After doing more research years later, I found out that there are multiple reports of this happening, and even some guys I served with later down the road ended up experiencing a mysterious man. I'm not a huge believer in the paranormal, and I never have been, but I have no logical explanation for who that man was. I can only hope that for as long as he has to continue his spiritual battle in Okinawa's jungles, his fellow brothers are willing to let him take a second to cool down and get a smoke break. That's what family does. I hope he is successful on whatever his mission is, so eventually one day he'll be able to rest for good. It was a chilly and quiet evening, and I was on the overnight shift at a grocery store. The store was nearly empty. It was long closed at 2 a.m. Just my boss and another coworker, Cam, were there. I found myself alone in the back loading area, where a dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the stacked boxes. I was unloading some skids. There was a single back door that was propped open with a bucket for my coworker to get back in. He was on break, and we would also use that door to go out for a smoke. My boss was asleep in the office around the corner from where I was. I felt a bit vulnerable being alone, but I just kept working. I was the new guy, and I still had something to prove. The store's security cameras gave me some comfort. They covered pretty much every part of the store, and they ran all night. I tried to push away any thoughts of stories I'd heard about night shift hauntings or strange occurrences in empty stores. I had experienced a few creepy things in the short time that I'd been doing it, but this is by far the worst. I was taking a quick break and checking some things on my phone. I was leaning against the wall near the open door. I could feel the cool breeze coming in. Just then, I heard a loud scream coming from outside. Curious and scared, I poked my head through the door and saw a woman running towards me. She looked really scared, like she was running away from Jason Voorhees or something. As she got closer, the look of terror on her face was more obvious, but I noticed something else. She was holding a big knife. I didn't know what to do. Should I help her or run away? My heart was racing, and I couldn't think clearly. In the end, I decided to run for my safety. I kicked the bucket out from the door and ran away, but the door didn't latch closed. It was too late to go back, though. As I ran, I heard the door burst open. She was in. I ran to my boss's office and woke him up. He thought I was messing with him at first, but I was basically crying, so that probably convinced him. We looked out into the store and saw the woman pacing up and down the aisles. We watched her closely, worried about her strange behavior. We were feeling vulnerable and scared, and we stayed hidden in the office. Fear held us back from taking action. Obviously, we needed to call the police, but we were worried that the slightest noise would set her off. I could still see the large knife in her hand. She walked slowly down the aisle, but she didn't seem to see us. My boss finally called the police to report what we had seen. He whispered softly into his phone. Meanwhile, I called my coworker, who was outside somewhere. I wasn't sure exactly where, and I was worried that he might run into this crazy woman. As we waited for the police to arrive, anxiety filled the air. We kept an eye on the woman from the safety of the office, hoping that help would arrive soon. We could have easily barricaded ourselves inside. I knew we were safe, but we were still worried about Cam. He was set to come back from his break any minute. Finally, the police arrived, and they arrested the woman. As they took her away, she was screaming about somebody chasing her. It was a puzzling situation, because nobody else was ever found in the area. That, and the security cameras covered the outside of the building. They caught her running outside, and nobody was following her. I think she was crazy, but what really scares me is why she had that knife. I guess she thought somebody was after her, so she would have had it for self-defense. I wonder what she would have done if she ran into Cam. Maybe she would have thought that he was the one who was after her.